it's Policing Love and Sex, Lives of Same-Sex Attracted People and the Law, not galore, in Newcastle and the Hunter, 1867-1954. Now, I'll just start off with a audio. You may need to up your...
It wasn't secret, yes. But you went to a toilet and if you were doing the beat and the young guy was standing next to you and he would be forward in, you know, egging you on. And then you find out when you expose yourself, the policeman.
Yeah.
It was terrible entrapment. What the police got away with was really cruel. It really was. And most of them were young guys. They used to send out on these beats and things like that would appeal to gay guys, you know.
Yeah.
And you could go to any toilet and you could have been caught, you know, because it's entrapment, because they can make all the movements. And then, but once you expose yourself, you're gone.
Yeah, there's an exposure.
And you get into this, you get into a court, and the judge would always take the word of the policeman and not you. Yeah. That's what was going on. It wasn't a secret, but you went to a toilet.
Okay, what I'll just go. That was Kevin Coleman, who was one of the so-called Yellow Sox people, and he's talking about his experiences in 1952 in Newcastle. Now, the aim of the essay, which I wrote during COVID lockdown, was to fill a gap in the Hunter Rainbow Histories page on the Living Histories website. To provide a context for the 1952 Newcastle Bullets, aka Yellow Sox, and to answer the question, did the police clampdown in 1952 come out of the blue, which is often portrayed. It seems like a one-off, but I'll prove otherwise. Acknowledge previous generations of same-sex attracted men in their lives in a hostile society. So we're going back to 1867. And build on Jim Wafer et al.'s Out in the Valley research for uncovering more Hunter Valley lesbian and gay history. So there were the aims. The end product, well, the essay will be put onto our website, and some people suggest that I do a book, write a book on it. I don't know. I've also had feedback saying the stories are too gut-wrenching, and I don't know whether that would be a great seller or whatever. So we'll just move on to the next one. So the problem with the data was that the data is the data resulting from court cases. So it doesn't tell the story of lesbians in the Hunter because there were no specific anti-lesbian laws, and the paperwork surrounding these court cases does not exist. And what we have is just the narrowly focused collection of evidence presented in court to prove cases of buggery or whatever. So it's a very narrow set of data we've got to work with. And in the future, we really need to build on a collection of correspondence and love letters and paintings and songs, etc., to build something closer to a realistic picture of these men. Yeah. So now the next one is, so there were two, basically, if you to understand the offences men were charged with, there were the indictable offences and the summary offences. The indictable ones were laid, charges were you arrested, you went to the magistrate's court, and charges were laid by magistrate in the police court, and the prisoner would be committed to stand trial in the Newcastle and Maitland Circuit Courts, or the Courts of Quarter Sessions. Then there were the summary offences, and these were by far the majority. A person was questioned, arrested, and remanded to appear and judged by a magistrate, generally in the Newcastle Police Court. The indictable offences were, and this is the Crimes Act, 1900. I'm not going back to 1828 or any further. I'll just do 1900. Crimes Act covered sodomy, the attempted buggery, indecent assault. That's assault plus an act of indecency, and act of indecency, and attempt to solicit or incite to solicit. And this came, well, the last one came in about 1954, after the Yellow Socks. The summary offences were basically under the Vagrancy Act and were came into existence as a broad brush tool for police to contain those on society's fringes. And originally it covered assessed the abandoned, the poor, drunk, mentally unwell, and interestingly, women who live with blacks, i.e. Indigenous men. Now, the Act was fashioned with some imaginative tweaking to also control the growing male same-sex attracted subculture, especially cruising for sex in public places. Now, body language or suggestions could be construed to be soliciting or suggesting consensual sex. And Kevin Coleman mentioned that in that short clip. Indecent exposure or having non-penetrative sex in public places were breaches of the Vagrancy Act. These crimes were heard only in the local police court, where evidence was not closely scrutinised and was prosecuted on the word of a policeman who had to decide on the signs and body language that an offence actually had occurred. It gave police discretionary powers and was a system that was often abused. And I won't go into the Douglas and Ann case in 1953, which exposed that in Sydney. Now, in the context of a largely middle-class history of LGBTI Australia, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex people in Australia, Newcastle history is almost entirely working class. And then we see the occupations of people who were arrested in that period. We have seamen, labourers, and members of the Defence Force, and they dominate the numbers arrested for the indictable offences. The same occupation pattern is reflected also in the arrests under the Vagrancy Act. And very few middle-class people were arrested, or at least they put their occupations as labourer, if they were respectable middle-class people, I suppose. The first story we're going to cover. Now, what I did in the paper was cover 31 stories, and they were derived from basically from the archives, state archives, and also from newspaper reports in the Newcastle Herald. This one came from the archives, and these have been digitised by a guy called Peter DeWaal in Sydney, and they're available online. So this first story is from 1880, and is typical of many colonial cases. It involves the arrest of two sailors, Henry Gimba and James Wilson, caught for having sex on Shepherd's Hill. There are four main characters in this story. There were two sailors. Henry Gimba was aged 20 and James Wilson was 55. There were two witnesses. They were miners, coal miners, Edward Tyndall, a miner living at the junction, and James Croft, a miner living in Tyers Hill. Now, early in the afternoon of Tuesday, the 7th of December, 1880, after a swim, Gimba and Wilson lay on the grass at Shepherd's Hill. Where they had swum is unknown, but for two same-sex attracted men, my bet would be it'd be on the male-only bogey hole rather than Susan Gilmore Beach. Testimony suggests they had been followed along the cliffs by Edward Tyndall. This also suggests that they were at the bogey hole. They didn't exactly lay on the grass, and Gimba lying face downwards, his trousers down, his backside bare, and Wilson on top. Wilson moving up and down on Gimba. Tyndall spotted, or perhaps waited and watched the two men, and after a short time, taking in what was happening, he asked, "Hello, what game's this?" Wilson replied, "Nothing, we are only having a bit of fun. We'd been down bathing and we did not fasten our clothes up right." James Croft then arrived. He was coming back from the beach with his son and was called over by Tyndall. Tyndall with Croft began taking the law into their own hands, gathering evidence that could send the two men to the gallows, and the death penalty was still in place in 1880. They made the older Wilson show them his genitals. They were damp, and the witnesses believed connection had occurred between Wilson and Gimber. Wilson admitted having sex and pleaded for mercy, but enterprising Tyndall demanded money on the assurance he kept quiet and Gimber and Wilson would not come up to Shepherd's Hill again. 5 shillings was handed over. Tyndall and Croft then followed the fleeing men to their lodgings, and this was Mrs. Sullivan's in Watt Street, and then called upon Senior Constable Griffith to make the arrest. At the hearing at Newcastle Police Court on Tuesday, December 7th, 1880, Wilson and Gimber were charged with committing a gross offence against nature, and Tyndall and Croft were praised by their worships for having followed both of them into town over steep cliffs and eventually run them into the earth with the police at their boarding house. The case was heard at Maitland Circuit Court on the 21st of April, 1881. The jury, directed by the Crown, found a verdict of both attempting to commit the offence of sodomy, and they were sentenced to 12 months hard labour in Maitland Jail. What I wanted to do was draw out some a continuity between 1880 and 1952. Now, I'll go back 4 years for another case, which was Frank Redmond, a sailor cook, who lived and obviously took men back to his lodgings in Sullivan's boarding house, which is the same place that Gimber and Wilson lived in 1880. And then the question now is, what role did Newcastle's boarding houses play in providing accommodation and privacy for same-sex attracted working class men and for visiting sailors? Boarding houses played this role certainly in inner city Sydney in the 19th century. And we know that Redmond, in his case, had lubricant ready in his room and entered the boarding house hand in hand with John Taylor. He was very much a modern homosexual man, cruising and picking up Taylor at the Market Street Wharf and taking him back to his pad. As visitors to Newcastle, Gimber and Wilson knew a lot about the local same-sex meeting places. If it's the Bogey Hole, Newcastle's popular male-only swinging hole, the Sailors' Boarding House, and a place to have sex out in the open. Knowledge one assumed shared in ports around the world. The treatment of Gimber and Wilson by the two vigilantes, the court and the press show that there was not an ounce of sympathy for the men arrested for sodomy. They could be humiliated, robbed by their assailants and described by the court as if they were animals. 70 years later, were things any better for same-sex attracted men? And we're talking now 1952. Paddy or Percy O'Brien and Barry Goodwin's arrests sparked the 1952 police blitz to break up Newcastle's homosexual network. The blitz was sparked by love letters Barry had kept for safekeeping in his trousers. And unfortunately for him, or unfortunately for historians, his mum or grandma found them emptying out the pockets on wash day at their house in New Lambton. His mum reported what she had found to the police, presumably in the hope that they could straighten out her son or arrest the older boyfriend. What mum did not know or understand that this was to play into the political power play between the New South Wales Police Commissioner and the state government and have devastating consequences for her son and the family. The menace of homosexuals had been first trumpeted in Newcastle as early as January 1948. We know from newspaper reports that the Newcastle beach toilets between 1947 and 52 have been targeted by police to combat the growing numbers of men using the toilets to pick up partners. At least 2 arrests were made using agent provocateurs. As Kevin explained at the start, all public toilets were targets. In January 1948, a press release from Newcastle Police claimed that Newcastle was now the epicentre of a New South Wales sex crime wave. Indecent behaviour arrests reported by local papers more than doubled in the 10 years between 1945 and 54 compared to the previous 10. So what I'm saying is that there was an increase in, well, at least in whatever indecent behaviour was in those days, and that would indicate that it was to do with men cruising, and the arrests had doubled from the previous 10 years in the 30s to the mid-40s to 1945 to 54. The Newcastle Police Superintendent Clifford followed up in December 48 with the news that plainclothes and women police were giving special attention in Newcastle of offences against decency, such as indecent exposure and similar acts. And that would be code for, again, men cruising for sex. The Sydney response around June 1948 continued into the 1950s. Police make drive on sex perverts appeared in The Truth. It claimed the numbers of homosexual perverts had reached an alarming magnitude in Sydney. So there was some truth behind the large number of men looking for sex. Now, the anti-homosexual rhetoric. Now, the common thing both in Newcastle and Sydney, they were trying to get these messages across to the public. There was no distinction between homosexuality and pedophilia. Older men were there to recruit young people into their cabals or whatever, thus undermining the moral fabric of the country. Citizens should grab homosexuals and call the police. Many men had returned from the war and had become same-sex attracted. A political message for politicians to give police more anti-homosexual powers. The fuse had been lit for a crackdown, and the situation was no longer in the control of Mrs. Goodwin in suburban Lambton. Now, this is a picture of Paddy or Percy O'Brien, and this is one of the love letters. Sergeant Smith and Constable Bell arrested Barry Goodman, who was Paddy's partner, outside Marcus Clark's store on the 6th of May 1952. They confronted him with Paddy O'Brien's love letters. Goodman cooperated with the police and provided a full statement. Goodman was taken off for a medical examination by Philip Rundle, who confirmed that he had had anal sex. The excruciating details of this examination was tabled as evidence to obtain a conviction under Section 79 of the Crimes Act. However, O'Brien was not expecting Goodwin to have confessed at all. And then when the police asked him, he said, "There is nothing in it, we were just friends," was his first response. It was then shown Goodwin's statements. After that, he had no choice but to corroborate Goodwin's statements. And soon 10 other men in the social group had been questioned and arrested. Now, I've called this the friendship circle number 1. There was 4 others, plus there was the Keith Robinson as well. Now, in this one, we have Paddy O'Brien and Barry Goodwin. I make the general point that the arrest of the 10 men, or the 11 men, began the unravelling of what had become one of Australia's first homosexual social groups here in Newcastle. 11 years before the Sydney's Chameleons was established, this group organised same-sex dances with drag performances in a public hall. They invited local and Sydney homosexual men, and 15 to 20 men turned up. Men and youths in drag performed to current songs, and men danced with each other to records played by Spin Bertel on a record player. Mention at the trials was made of the same-sex wedding at another location, and there were house and beach parties. Parties allowed these men privacy and safety of sex at houses with spare bedrooms, a premium for working class men and visitors to Newcastle in the early 50s. After police questioning, O'Brien was charged with committing buggery and indecent assault on Goodwin, and Goodwin the same on O'Brien. Paddy O'Brien got 6 years for buggery and 18 months for indecent assault to be served concurrently. Barry Goodwin received a 2-year good behaviour bond. As the investigation proceeded, Newcastle police had uncovered what was described at the time as a society of perverts. Now, what I've done in the essay was to sort of round out these people and sort of give an idea of exactly who these people were. And in the court documents we have descriptions of Paddy and of Barry Goodwin. Paddy O'Brien was a single man. He was in Newcastle from Dapto after an operation at Wallsend Hospital and decided to stay there with friends. O'Brien described to his probation officer that his home life was good. His father had married twice, and O'Brien had 17 siblings. His mother had been a widow since 1949, and he had been supporting her. He had not told her of his arrest. O'Brien had served, as many in the group had served in the AIF, and was discharged medically on 5941 and received a pension. He often felt depressed. Like Goodwin, he had worked at Marcus Clark, was an active member of their social club. In Newcastle Quarter Sessions, he pleaded a war neurosis that he had to look after his widowed mother. However, Judge Brereton said he could not treat his case with any leniency. Back in 1880, James Wilson unsuccessfully attempted to mitigate his punishment by claiming he and Gimba were just having a lark. And in 1952, war neurosis had no effect on Judge Brereton. Barry Goodwin, 19, was a National Service trainee with the Australian Navy and a shop assistant at Marcus Clark, and he was sacked after his arrest. His family situation was described by his probation officer as good. Goodwin spent his leisure hours reading books of fiction after the arrest, but prior to that, he would spend 3 evenings a week with Paddy and 3 at the cinema with the family or with his young lady. And then, as a quote from the probation report, she is aware of these proceedings, but her feelings towards the offender remain unaltered. O'Brien's statement to the police described the flowering of his and Barry's relationship. And in January 1952, after knowing each other for 5 months, they went to the bogey hole one night and had sex. Barry would then regularly visit him in Hamilton. They went to a party in Sydney in May, staying with friends in King's Cross. And there we have a connection across 70 years, and that's the bogey hole. Love letters preserved from the trial. Paddy O'Brien's love letters to Barry are evidence of a deep and physical, emotional relationship between the two men. Paddy took the initiative in the relationship and describing him as his flighty filly and got very jealous of rivals. He closes his letter, I love you and I never want anyone else, only you. We do not have similar declarations of love between Gimba and Wilson in 1880, but it is clear from the incident, their living relationships and the evidence of the trial that they were partners and stuck together throughout the shakedown, the arrest and the trial. In 1952, each friendship circle collapsed as each man confessed. Goodwin and O'Brien, Albert Jones, Kenneth Scottman, Mel Devoren, Robert Jordan, and Bill Hepplewhite, Michael Robbins, Charlie Hollings, and Dudley Stevens. Now, Keith Robinson was the last arrested and had been described as the sort of Mr. Big of the operation. Keith owned a men's store in Hunter Street, which was quite avant-garde in the day, and he hosted fashion parades for charities at the town hall. On legal advice, he was able to persuade the magistrate at the Newcastle Police Court to be granted a trial at Sydney Quarter Sessions, not Newcastle. He also had his railway apprentice lover, Kevin, who did not buckle under police questioning. Now, I've got the interview with Kevin, and he's talking about his interview with the Vice Squad in 1952.
One Friday afternoon, the clerk came up and said, the manager wants to see you in his office. That's big, you know. So I went into the office, and here's these two big burly, obviously detectives. And Mr. Agnew was a good manager at the time, a lovely man, really nice. Anyway, he said to me, Kevin, he said, these two gentlemen want to talk to you. And he said, do you want to use my office or what? they said, no, we want to take him up to the vice squad rooms. And so the vice squad those days was located on the corner of Scott Street and Pacific Street, on that corner. I think the building's still there. It's an old building. They were in there. So I said, okay. So and they took me up in a bus. We went over where the workshop was, over to Hunter Street, and caught the bus. And I'll never forget this. As we were getting onto the bus, one of them bumped me with his arm. Oh, he said, I'm sorry, excuse me. And now I think that was a little bit of a ploy to get me even more so upset than I was already, playing my emotions. So anyway, he gets up there and they introduced me to the chief of the vice squad. And I had three of them in the room because they're firing all sorts of questions at me. And I'm keeping my cool, and they told me, if you say that you'd had sex with Keith, I just forget the exact words they were using. They said, if you had sex with Keith Robinson, they said, we won't publish your name, but we will publish his name. And then I thought to myself, and this is funny, and I'm thinking to myself, how can they charge you without mentioning my name? Because they were charging guys with this. They're not charging the guys whose name was published. I thought, how are they going to do that? This is going through my mind while they're firing those questions at me. Because I was denying everything, obviously. Anyway, so I was more persistent and I was holding myself together, So anyway, I forget how long I was there or anything like that. I always forget. And anyway, they ended up after they said they knew they weren't going to get anywhere with me. So they said, oh, okay, we're finished. And they took me back to the works manager's office. So they left me there. And as soon as I walked out the door, all this emotion, all this tension of building up in me just came out. I broke down and I was crying and I was a mess. And the manager put his arm around me and said, don't you go back to the workshop. He said, you go home. So I went home because as I got home, Mum said, oh, you're home early, And she said, well, what's wrong with you? I said, oh, nothing, Mum, nothing, Mum. So I went into my room. And when Dad came home, Dad came in. He said, what's all this about? Sort of thing. And I said, oh, I've been with the police and accused me of being homosexual. All this, with Keith Robinson. And I said, I forget what was said, but I was, I told him, and he said, oh, yeah. So it turns out that Dad knew the chief of the vice squad from Lismore. Dad knew him in Lismore. Dad knew him. So Dad said, oh, I'm going in to question him about this. So Dad went in to talk to him. You know what? My father came home, never said a word to him. Not a word. One Friday afternoon.
Just as a follow-on from that, the interview continues on, and Kevin, years later, Kevin's sister tells him that his mum and dad had an argument when Dad arrived home, and he wanted to throw Kevin out of the house, and his mum stood up to him, and then he just went silent. So it was pretty tense. Dad didn't just roll over. He was adamant that his son was to be thrown out the house. Now, I just wanted to cover before we left the myth of the yellow socks scan. It keeps getting repeated, and it will it's one of those myths that will keep repeating. Just to say that there is no evidence that the social circle itself had adopted a call sign of yellow socks or ties. Kevin, the last witness to the Blitz, denied it existed, and in the climate of paranoia, which was engineered by Police Commissioner Delaney in Sydney, discretion was the name of the game for all same-sex attractive men in Newcastle. So it's very doubtful that when you would advertise yourself to the police. Well, thanks. I hope that wasn't too rushed. I'll just exit now. You want to stop share?
Thank you very much, John. That was absolutely fascinating. And any questions for John? I'm just I'm amazed. It's fantastic, intriguing, history and stories and tragedy all mixed in. So, any questions for John? Observations, comments?
I've just got to apologise to John for getting the title so incorrect. That's what happens when you talk to people on the phone and you don't get an email with the correct title in it. So sorry, I was just glamorising it a bit there, weren't I?
Sorry, John. I like that initial title. I thought Galore in it was fantastic. I thought, what's he doing?
John, I've just got a question. You mentioned there were events, O'Brien and Goodwin, like they'd attend different events that were put on. Where were they held?
The National Park Women's Bowling Club.
Yeah.
And that, I thought that was just a one-off by that group, but going through Trove, there were community dances held there, and certain people got arrested there for whatever, and so it was a community place. So one week they would have the Yellow Socks, so-called, and then they'd have another community group for a dance there. So it wasn't that unusual.
And also, just another quick question. Sutherland's boarding house. Do you know the background of who Sutherland is?
No, I don't know much about that. I think that I'd like to follow that up, because with those two cases, it obviously was a place where sailors would at least stay. When Redmond and the other one went through, the door, it was opened by somebody in the house. The person opening the door let them through, and in their presence, they were holding each other's hands. So it was, I would say a safe house, at least. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And in Sydney, there's a whole thing. There's a number of cases that came out from the archives, and they plotted where each person was staying, and they would go around to each person's house, boarding house, and then they would socialise there.
Fabulous. Any other questions or observations? I think they're all awestruck. I like the fact that those parties with the drag queens are another Newcastle first.
That's great.
So John, how much of this material wasn't out in the valley? Is this all new, or just
no?
You decided to look into a bit more detail?
It was about 4 of those cases that Jim Wafer had covered in his. I never reread those cases, and went off independently just to get my own slant on things.
Okay.
But when I went back, there was about 4, but there was many more, and the newspapers, I went through the Trove. I mean, Jim didn't have access to Trove when he wrote out in the valley, so that was a great asset.
Yeah. Look, the whole matter is dreadful lore that's come to us since our earliest times, and it really is. Thank goodness the social history related to the various matters is really devastating, really. And the story of the people needs to be told. The actual, the knowing many similar people, I just think that it's the stories of the law cases are really just tragic, and are a bit like the law cases that sent people out to Australia for 7 years and the like, or life.
Yeah.
Really, we've come a long way. We really have, but no. But each one of those people were individually interesting people, and they need their stories told, and their family.
Yeah, because it's kind of sad that you're gaining a lot of this knowledge out of court cases where they were punished and you know, publicly humiliated, as opposed to how, you know, histories usually are constructed from people's personal records that they feel comfortable keeping and sharing. So it'd be interesting to see what happens out of all this. The more this research is made accessible, it'd be interesting to see whether there are any such family archives that have been sort of saved, you know.
Yeah, I have.
To give us an alternate view as opposed to the one that comes from, you know, arrest and court trials and things like that.
There was somebody who popped up in Facebook, and his uncle was one of the Yellow Sox people, and the story was that, you know, he was supported by the family and lived with his partner on a farm. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, and the person hasn't got back in contact with me. So, but that there may be a source of letters and a whole other version of what happened in 1952 from that source. Yeah.
Anyway, it'll be fascinating to see what happens. I know that the Living Histories platform is very discoverable. So the minute you put that content up there, I'm sure people will find it and make those connections.
Yeah.
Any other questions before I thank John? Then I say thank you, John. Thank you very much.